Good morning to you. Thank you very much indeed, Owen. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you to AFSA. I've been delighted to speak at, I think, 3 or 4 AFSA events over the years, and I've always been impressed by not just the fact you can organize an event like this, and the social element, of course, but the fact that you do so much great work ensuring that the voices are heard of those, particularly from the minority communities within the fire service. I should say at the outset, I wasn't expecting to be here. I'll be honest with you, you won't know this, but I was asked 6 months ago to speak at the conference, and nobody else came back to me after that. And then that weekend, I got the email of the program, and the chief fire officer telling everybody he's delighted that I'm going to be here. So I literally had to drop everything, and I was supposed to have dinner with the Coronation Street last night. Yeah, well, there you go. You saved me from that, and I'm supposed to be at a board meeting this morning. So I've literally had to rearrange my calendar to be here with you, but I couldn't miss this. It was really important to me to be here with you. Unfortunately, though, I have to leave at noon to carry on with the rest of my day. So that's an immediate apology. But firstly, to reiterate what Owen and Alex said, thank you for all that you do. I've said this in every environment that I've spoken about the fire services of this country. You are phenomenal, and the work you do in keeping us safe is second to none, and it remains the case. I mean, even in the report I did on London Fire Brigade, I made that point. I wanted people not to miss that point. This is not a commentary on the professionalism of the fire service, which is, as I said, second to none, and world-leading in many respects. But I think there's some questions that have been asked and answered around the resources you have. I mean, there's a great fire station next door. Was this deliberate that you chose the hotel right next to the fire station? But when I went around London Fire Brigade, I looked at fire stations, which seemed to have been there 300 years or something, and looked 300 years old. And there's some issue for me, and Mustak's here from Director of Finance from London LFB, but investment in your premises would be really good. And it just struck me that I felt I was going backwards in some places, and you've been left behind, whereas other services have not been left behind. And I think it's an issue that will resonate with, I suspect, all of you during the time. Now, in many, many roles, I mean, I was the Chief Prosecutor for the North West of England. I was Director of Prosecution in London. I was Chief Executive of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners. I've literally had roles which were, I suppose, at the cutting edge of tackling injustices. I'm now, amongst many roles, I'm Chancellor of the University of Manchester, I'm Chair of the Catholic Church's Regulator, me, a good Muslim boy from Birmingham, Chair of the Catholic Church Regulator of Safeguarding, and I'm trustee of 9 different charities, all of them women-led, and all of them working to tackle violence against women and girls. It is a real honor to be in all of those roles. And when I was asked about 18 months ago now to conduct the review into London Fire Brigade, I went in there with knowing little, if anything, about fire services, other than perhaps 2 meetings I've had with AFSA prior to that. And so I went in with a blank piece of paper, not knowing anything. I had some assumptions. I assumed, for example, that because they'd had a female commissioner, that women were being treated fairly. I assumed that it was London, so it's the most diverse city on earth, that the fire service would be treating people of colour fairly. Similarly, with the extraordinary population of LGBT communities, I assumed that it was dealing with LGBT issues fairly. I follow the evidence. That's the important thing, is that it's not about what I think, it's not about what I say, it's about what you said. And when I did the report, when I published the report, I made the point, and I'll say it again, these are the voices of 2,000 staff who work for London Fire Brigade. I've literally been just the amplifier of those voices. And I think one of the things that leaders don't learn, I've shared this with Alex this morning, is that listening is a value, a skill that we don't value when it comes to leadership. We like talking, writing, shouting, screaming, whatever it may be, but listening is the least valued and probably the most important skill a leader has to demonstrate. And so what the report was about was giving an opportunity to staff who previously had never had, I think, the opportunity to do so. You mentioned the Jaden's suicide. There was, of course, the Grenfell fire had happened 4 years previously then. There was significant numbers of issues that were in the public eye, but I had no real sense of what was going on. And so I simply allowed people to speak. And one of the first things I learned very quickly, actually, was people were scared. And this shocked me to the core, to the point where I had to create the most secure email address known to man or woman or anybody else for that matter, in order for people to be able to share by email. A Proton Mail, I don't know if you've heard of Proton Mail, literally it's the most secure email address you can get. I had to create one of those. I had to reassure everybody. My first month or so was spent reassuring staff, I'm not going to tell them it's you. And I thought, why are people so scared? They're working and have been working for years and years in this environment, yet they feel scared. So I did that. I tried to build confidence. I tried to provide security and ultimately to ensure people to speak up. And then it opened. Literally, the dam opened. And now I'll give you one example, which I've shared publicly before, was I've dealt with more murders than anybody in this room. Even you, Sunita, and more. I've sat with families of deceased. I have seen the worst that humanity can do to you. Yet, there was one day in February of last year where I had a day with members of staff from LFB, 9 women, in fact, who came to see me one after another. So I had an hour or so with each of them, and by the end of the day, I'd run out of tissues. By the end of the day, I needed counselling. I had never in my life submitted myself to counselling, but decided that I needed it because of what the stories I'd heard, what people were sharing with me about their experiences on a daily basis. It was shocking to the core. And I knew then that something was not right. And so I put an enormous amount of resource into this. Firstly, credit goes to the Commissioner of the Fire Service, Andy Rowe. Andy Rowe invited me in. He wasn't forced to do so. He didn't have to do so. Also credit to the Mayor of London for funding it and resourcing it. But the reality is that literally, I was now being knocked on every door that we had. People were telling me, let's share our story, let's share our story. And hundreds of people were beginning to share their stories, and it was shocking to the core. I'm not going to rehearse the contents of the report. They're out there, you can listen to them, you can read them, and you'll be able to experience things, and you'll hear things I've no doubt that you will have heard in your own environments, and they remain shocking even now, 6 months after the report was published. And so, I then formed the view, when it came to analysing what I'd heard, I realised, yes, there's misogyny, yes, there is racism, yes, there's homophobia, yes, there is bullying and harassment, all of those things. But then I had to make a judgment about whether it was institutional. And some of you will be mindful of the debate around that. What difference between institutional is it individuals, or is the organisation in some way responsible for the fact that this exists? And it was obvious to me, if you look at the disciplinary data, if you look at the complaints that were being received, looking at how the complaints were being dealt with, that it was structural. The issues here were structural. People were literally not being able to feel safe in their workplaces. That's a strong statement. But it's a reality. And I think what Owen said a moment ago, and I'll come on to that in a moment, is there is no workplace in this country that could put hand on heart and say, we are safe. And that we've tackled all of the issues that I've just touched upon. It is endemic in organizations, and very much so within public services, but beyond that, actually, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So, yes, absolutely, it was institutionalized. The people that I worked with, a professor of workplace management, a professor of mental health. The other thing about mental health is that we discovered enormous amounts of untreated PTSD in LFB. Now, are you telling me that doesn't exist in your fire services? Do you have things in place to ensure that your fire officers, your staff, can be treated, or at least know that they can? There's somewhere where they can go to get some help for what they're suffering? And this was extraordinary to me, that an institution that has been around as it was for 150 years, that has the respect of citizens of London, was not looking after its own staff. And I found that really, really telling. And so when the report was published, the report was leaked, actually. It was due to be published on the Monday, and I thought I had a weekend to prepare for it. It came out on the Friday night, and my weekend was utterly destroyed. But because people wanted to know, people just couldn't understand why, because we'd heard about policing. We'd heard about other agencies and organizations. nobody assumed it was happening. It's total ignorance, isn't it? To use Owen's phrase, nobody assumed that it was happening in the fire service, but unfortunately, it was. And so there was a real public appetite. And the thing that I wasn't prepared for, though, is that suddenly everybody knew me and this particular issue. And I literally was inundated with contacts. I have the shittiest website known to man, but it has a contact page. And so people were contacting me via my website, people were contacting me via Twitter, people were contacting me through all means, up and down the country and around the world, saying, this is us, this is us. We're feeling this too, and nobody's listened to me. And I couldn't believe what was happening. And it wasn't just fire services. So on the Saturday, I was getting phone calls from BBC staff. I was getting phone calls from NHS staff. I was getting emails from, you name it. So when I did some interviews on the Saturday, that's what I mentioned. So the Sunday Times headline was, "It's everywhere." And it was almost like a surprise. I really couldn't get over why people were surprised that we haven't got this issue of workplace safety sorted. But anyway, the point is that it was happening. And then obviously, firefighters were contacting me, and fire staff were contacting me in enormous numbers. When I did the last recce I did, I was giving evidence to the London Assembly in end of January, so I went through all my contacts. And by the end of January, so in that 2.5 month period, 250 plus fire service staff up and down the country had contacted me to talk about their experiences. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not Batman. There's nothing I could do for them. And I was trying to signpost as many as I could for help. There were some that really did need help. There was, again, I don't know if I've said this publicly, there were a number that were threatened to kill themselves. And so I had to give them a great deal of attention. I couldn't just simply send the email on to somebody. I had to speak to them. I had to make sure that they had access to services. If they didn't, I would then signpost them to an NGO that would provide them with support. This is fire service staff in this country threatening to kill themselves because of their experiences. And I literally couldn't deal with this myself. I just couldn't understand what was happening, what was going on. And I don't have a massive team of people behind me. I handed in my LFB office card on the 30th of November. I couldn't go back in. I'm not part of the fire service. This has to be your issue. This has to be you to fix, not for me to fix. And the good news, though, was LFB accepted everything. I mean, the recommendations were entirely accepted. The contents were entirely accepted, as by the Mayor of London, the London Assembly. When I gave evidence to them, they've accepted absolutely everything in the report. I credit again to the number of times, I can't begin to tell you the number of times I've run into a fire officer from anywhere in this country, at a train station, at a bus station, anywhere, and they come up to me and say, "Nazir, thank you. It's just given me," this is them talking, "the ability to talk about what's happening to me." And it shocked me again that people who are professionals like yourselves, people who are experienced, who are networked like you are, felt that you had nobody wanting to listen to you. And that remains work in progress. I know what Alex has said, and I know what AFSA are doing, I know what Mark and the NFCC I've spoken at their conference, are committed to doing, but it is literally that you're in the foothills of that journey, of that mountain, because there are still hundreds and hundreds of people who are waiting for you to hear their stories. And so, as I said a moment ago, this is not about, but there is good news. I mean, some of the things I found, for example, Soho Fire Station, which is right in the heart of the city centre. I think it's the busiest fire station, certainly in this country. I think it's the busiest fire station in Europe. Yet, when I spoke to the people of Soho, there aren't many people in Soho, they tend to go in and out, they absolutely love them. And do you know why they love them? And this was, again, something I hadn't learned, was that the engagement by the fire service at Soho Fire Station with the public was second to none. This is somebody said to me, somebody described it this way, that when you go to a fire station, the doors are closed. The only time they're open is when they're out. I hadn't really appreciated that. And I learned that, that LFB had a policy where every room, there was a room in every fire station, every 104 fire stations, a room in every fire station that was a community room that could be booked by community groups. The community didn't know that happened, but never mind that, the staff of LFB didn't know they had a room. So there were some serious issues around internal comms, some serious issues around external comms. The process of dealing with complaints was really poor. So I recommended independent investigation. And again, credit to Andy Rowe. The day my report was eventually published, the Monday, he'd already tendered for independent investigators. And in the first week or two, they'd had dozens and dozens and dozens of people approaching their investigators in relation to grievances or complaints they had. And that was quite extraordinary that they'd done that. The fact that you had, there has been seismic change, and others can talk about it, within the senior management team at LFB. There has been a real opportunity for networks like AFSA and others to finally get a place at the table, and that's quite important. It's not enough to be consulted. You need to be in the decision making. You need to be in the role. This badge actually reflects that. This is the Grenfell badge. When you speak to, and I have done, I'm really privileged to have spoken to the families of those who lost their lives. And I've spoken to them, 72 lives lost, 18 children. I've spoken to firefighters who were there on the night, and they told me, one in particular told me he went into a room and there were 4 children who had died of smoke inhalation. I don't know how you recover from seeing that. I don't know. But when I spoke to the families, I asked them this one question: what would have prevented it from happening? And without exception, they all said, if we had been on the decision-making board deciding what cladding goes on that building, if we, the people who are most impacted by decision, were actually on the board, then maybe we'd still be alive. And that is significant, isn't it? So diversity is not about numbers and quotas and those kinds. It's about making an impact. It's by being in the decision-making room when the decisions are being made, not being the person that carries out the consultation. This is what really pisses me off. For those of you who know I get pissed off. We are today celebrating 75 years of Windrush. Congratulations to everybody who's celebrating that. We had the Scarman report in 1981, which was following the riots that took place in Toxteth and Brixton, which found institutional racism. We had the Macpherson report in 1999, which found institutional racism. And agency after agency, the one I was involved in, the Crown Prosecution Service, within days of the Macpherson report, we admitted we were institutionally racist. Do you remember that? Do you remember there was a race, literally the word race, a race by organizations who wanted to admit they were institutionally racist? And I thought, that's really good. Do you know, subsequently I realized what was happening? It was like, once we admit it, you won't look at us anymore. That was actually what was happening. So, the CPS and all of us could say, go and look at them. They haven't admitted anything yet. That's what was happening. That was what was happening. So we had Macpherson. Then we had Lammy's report in 2017 on criminal justice. We had my report. We've had the Casey report. Yesterday, the National Crime Agency report. We had HMIC's reports. Oh, my God. Why do we need these reports? Well, we need them because we need to be constantly reminded that we barely started this work. And why, I was asked many times with Macpherson, why we haven't moved on. Or why hasn't there been an improvement? And I look back and I thought, hang on, one of the reasons might be is we all did the same things. We all developed a strategy, a national, local race strategy or a group race strategy, and then we put it in a filing cabinet. We all employed EDI officers, remember them? Some of you are here. And I bet you're not on the board. Yeah, well, you may be now. But, back then you were not on the board. You were carrying out the stakeholder consultations. Remember that? We were just ticking boxes left, right, and center. Ticking boxes left, right, and center, but ultimately bringing no change. And so that's why we are where we are. why little progress has been made is because we all do the same things over and over again. I've written an article for the personnel management. I didn't even know it existed, which apparently is the HR Bible, and it came out last month. And I called it the decency deficit. Why have we got workplaces where there is a decency deficit? When people just don't feel able to be kind to each other, where we don't address long-standing concerns, that we treat the victim as if somehow they're responsible. So many people told me that once they made a complaint, they were the ones that were moved. Have you experienced that? They were the ones that were moved. Oh, and then they found the perpetrator, he was the one that was progressed, right? Because it was a way of dealing with the problem, you know? So many nodding heads. This is 2023, and we're doing the same things over and over again. My most recent book is called The Race to the Top, and I've just signed a copy in the back, so thank you so much for bringing it. The book stems from a conversation I had with somebody called Theresa May, remember her? And she said to me, Nazir, look, you're the I was chief exec of the police commissioners then. She said, given you're the chief exec, how can there be structural racism? I said, have you got a few minutes? And to her credit, she gave me a few minutes, and I explained to her the journey. Just because you get to the top or near the top does not vaccinate you or make you immune from bigotry and racism. Actually, it's even more, but it's more sophisticated. And so I wanted to get that. So the book is all about capturing the voices of people of color in positions of power across British society. So in the public sector, in business, in health, et cetera, because it's everywhere. We've just come through COVID, I think. And some of you, I lost my brother in the second week of COVID. He died at home, all alone, having not been tested because community testing had been stopped. And I remember going to, I checked the rules to see whether I could travel to see him. And it said, yes, you could. That was an exception. So I went down to his home. I found his body was upstairs. The undertaker wouldn't come into the house because the undertaker was broken himself. He had picked up 14 bodies. He was a Muslim undertaker. He picked up 14 bodies from home that day when he got to my brother. Secondly, he wouldn't come into the house, so he gave me and my brothers a body bag. We're wearing full PPE. We put my brother into a body bag. We carry him down the stairs. We put him on a trolley, and he's taken away. And what I'm reminded of, and what that reminds me of, is the number of people from Black and Asian backgrounds that were dying in the first few weeks of COVID. In public services, you were dying in hospitals as doctors and nurses. You were dying as bus drivers, transport. You were dying in extraordinary numbers. And we have learned now that disproportionately people of color were dying from COVID. And so health inequalities is something perhaps we haven't paid a lot of attention to. And then more recently, we've discovered that Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. Hang on, what's going on here? And so we realize that inequality is not just a workplace issue, it's a health issue. It's when you look at policing and justice, which is an area I'm very familiar with, and I know you are as well, you're 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're a black man. You are more likely as a black man to be arrested, to be charged, to be sentenced to prison as a black man on the same evidence as a white man. So it's not about different evidence. So the systemic racism in Jagtar, systemic racism in justice, systemic racism in health, systemic racism in authority after organization after organization. Strangely, when I spoke to business leaders, I found there wasn't as much. And do you know why there wasn't? They said, we don't care what color you are as long as you make some money. All right, okay. Public sector, endemic. Institution I love to pieces. I've worked in all my life, and I found it, I couldn't believe how deep-seated it was. Organization after organization, people who were applying for posts who were turned down despite being the best qualified person. And some of the things we put in place, by the way, were complete failures. So the idea, for example, of the Rooney Rule. Do you know the Rooney Rule? Anybody? It's nothing to do with Wayne Rooney. The Rooney Rule is that when you get to the final shortlist, you have at least one person from a minority in the final shortlist. It's a great idea, it's an American concept, and it means that you're more likely to progress to the higher ranks when you have the opportunity at least to be shortlisted. And that was a theory. The reality is this, is that when they're not appointed, when they're not appointed, they can't go to a tribunal because they were shortlisted. So something that was brought in to actually perhaps improve progression has now been used as something to attack you when you decide that you think you've been discriminated against. My point is that things that have been put in place to work haven't worked. Things that we've time and time again, we've done the same thing over and over again. That's definition of insanity, expecting a different result. That doesn't happen. That we have institutions, I'm afraid, that seem to be wanting to work, to listen, but refusing to do so. But I'll finish with this story. Why is it important that you listen? Why is it important? It's a justice story, not a policing story or fire story. I prosecuted the Stuart Hall, BBC presenter Stuart Hall, for his abuse of women and girls. And about a year ago, that website I mentioned, that really shitty one, got an email. And it was this. It was, "Dear Mr. Afzal, you won't remember me. I was one of the victims of Stuart Hall. I now have terminal cancer. I'm about to die. A few weeks left. I wanted you to know that my life began when you gave me justice." And I sat and looked at this email for a couple of days wondering, how do I respond to this? Do I just say, "Thank you" is not good enough, is it? So I sent her my number and I spoke to her. She said, when finally somebody had listened, after 30-odd years of nobody listened to her, of ignoring her, of treating her as the victim, as blaming her, as suggesting that she was in some way responsible for what happened to her, that finally somebody had listened and she could begin her life. And here she was about to leave this world, and she has now. She wanted me to know that was the power of listening. That was the impact that you can have by listening to somebody. And that was massive. And I went to her funeral, Jack. I want to tell you this. I went to her funeral, a woman I've never met in my life, never will meet in my life. And I was wondering why I was there. And you know why I was there? Because somebody said to me, "Nazir, you changed my life." And I wanted her to know that she changed mine. Thank you.
So the mic's going to go around. Can we give Nazir a piece of paper so he can just make a few notes on the questions? Because I saw this technique where you ask 5 or 6 questions and then the speaker chooses 3 or 4. That's not because they don't want to answer all the questions. It's so we get all the questions on the table. And if there's questions that are unanswered throughout the course of the day, I'm asking my panel members, other speakers, to make sure these are the issues that we want to discuss and debate. Whilst I'm waiting to see hands up and Dal go to a hand, I just want to make a couple of comments on what Nazir said to amplify his points. Just because you have got to the top doesn't mean to say you're vaccinated from racism. Does that resonate, Wayne, Alison? Yes, it does. Yes, we got to the top, but we still face discrimination in those rooms. So thank you for elevating that point, because people do believe, oh, Wayne's the chief fire officer and he's black, he must be okay. No, he still needs your support. He still needs your backing. And same with Alison. Health inequalities. If you get this right, I will buy Nazir's book. I will go to his house and get it signed for you. And I'll deliver it to your house. So I'm going to pay for everything. In one country in the world, the USA, the black women have the same mortality rates during pregnancy as white women. Everywhere else, including this country, black women 10 times worse some places. Tower Hamlets used to be 10 times worse. But they looked at the data and they did something about it. Where is that? In the United States. What occupation? Because it gives you the answer that the cause is not race. Nobody? You know the answer. Go on then. Yep, in the military. Why in the military? He's not getting it. He's related to me, so he can. In the military, the reason is when you're pregnant in the military in the United States, your access to services is exactly the same as another white woman. Your experience in getting those services is exactly the same. And the consultants treat you in exactly the same way. And therefore, mortality rates are the same. So why did black and Asian members of the NHS die disproportionately? The first 50 deaths were black and Asian during COVID because they didn't have access to PPE. Some of the nurses, the Filipino nurses, their face-fit masks did not fit them. Many of them were disproportionately put in the front line. when others were withdrawn from the front line, and of course their treatment when they are objected about certain shifts and stuff were get on with it. We're in a command and control. We know command and control isn't bullying people to telling them what to do, listening. And Nazir, that last point I want to make is, you came to the APNA conference and AFSA conference, you've said this so many times now, we will have an award for leaders that listen and do something about what they've heard. We'll do something about it, and we'll call it the Nazir AFSA report, Award, and we'll charge you £1,000 a year to sponsor it. Okay, who's the first question? First question, please.
Thanks, and thanks, Nazir. My name's Leon Parks from Greater Manchester. Really, really powerful input, and you talked in your input about report after report. And I'm aware of reports in the fire and rescue sector that go back 20, 30 years. Do you believe this is a watershed moment, or are we at risk of having another report? Thank you.
You know, I'm always the optimist, Leon, and I think, yes, it has, and I think maybe because of the reaction. The fact that people, I've given the example where I've walked into places and people have said to me, thank you for amplifying our voices. People feel empowered right now. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, though. So we've got to make the most of it, Mark and others, to be able to respond to what people are saying right now. Because if they're not listened to in the next few weeks and months, they'll never be listened to. And it's a massive loss if we don't do that. So, yes, I think we're at a turning point, a reckoning point, where people, I suspect, are prepared to speak up right now. And there is currently a leadership commitment to deliver the change. But the answer to making that happen is you holding their feet to the fire.
Coming on this question, because Mark Hardingham will agree that we had a conversation about one or two chiefs saying this is a watershed moment. The AFSA view is not a watershed moment. You've had plenty of watershed moments. Tom Buck report, thematic report, Bain report. We've had the select committee reports. This is another moment in time to reflect, why have you not achieved on the recommendations of the past? And we as AFSA encourage you, it is a journey. There will never be a destination you'll reach, but keep measuring what you're doing. The words we heard from Alex yesterday, yes, I'm committed to this, I'm going to do this, and we will. That was an appraisal we held for him yesterday, by the way, Chief Exec. So we'll give you the notes from yesterday's meeting. Next, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Temi Bawahimi. I'm Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Hertfordshire County Council. You mentioned something about strategies coming out, or reports that would come out, and then you would see action, and action followed by impact. And recently we had George Floyd's death, and there was a lot of action and impact. I have a close family friend who, at the time of George Floyd's death, was involved in some merchandise that went through the roof. And all of a sudden that started to pan out. And one of the things I noted was that there was this thing sort of like, if a white person said something, it was hailed. For instance, if they said something about Black Power, it was on social media, somebody had made a statement, and there was a lot of reference to it. But as a Black person, when they had said something, there was no response. And they likened it to a gentleman's club culture. And when I read the report regarding the London Fire Brigade, you mentioned that. And I'm just wondering, where you have cultures where you have people in power who have a certain club, it's very difficult, one, to break that, but two, to have those voices heard. So I was at a conference last week where we spoke about alternative global majority and using that term, and someone said, well, it's great, we might be the majority, but the minority hold the power. Yeah. And I think within our fire service, within all of the institutions that you mentioned, too often that power is at the center. And that makes it really difficult if you have a culture of the gentleman's club to break that. So my question is, how do we infiltrate those sort of behaviors where it's like the mates, whatever you call it, but it's very difficult to break those inner circles, say within a fire station. So that's my question. How we
that's a phenomenal question. Thank you very much indeed. Well, one of the things we can do is what you're doing today. The power of networks can't be underestimated. You're 100% right. I mean, power is centered in a group of people, generally white men, and people will listen to them. And I remember when I did BBC Question Time a few months ago, and there was a question about race that came up, and Fiona Bruce goes, Nazir Afzal, So why are you asking me? Why are you asking 4 white people about racism before you come to me first? So we're asked specific questions. Very often it's to say how bad things are, rather than asking the other people what they're going to do about it. And so you're 100% right that our voices aren't heard, but as a network, you will be heard. So the power of AFSA, the power of APNA, NHS, the power of organizations where people come together and speak with one voice and do so relentlessly, that is something that's really useful. Also, let's not underestimate the power of media and social media. We have strong voices now in the media. We have strong voices very much on social media. We should make use of those environments. The campaigns you mentioned around George Floyd, Black Lives, etc., were very good media campaigns, and so we've got to ensure that it doesn't fade out after a few weeks and months, that we're constantly doing that. So yes, power of networks is really good, but also the power of representation. I was asked a question. I know there are Home Office officials in the room, so please forgive me for saying this. But I've worked with 10 Home Secretaries. And some of the things that we were able to achieve in the 2000s, early 2000s, were because the Home Office were listening, always listening. And responding as a result to what people were saying that needed to change, et cetera, et cetera. My fear right now is that we don't have, we may have representation. I was asked a question about, well, surely the world's changed now. You've got a brown Prime Minister and a brown Home Secretary. I don't know what you think, but my point is representation isn't enough. Actions speak louder than your words. Actions speak louder than presence. So we need to ensure that when you get to a position, if you are a black or brown CFO, that you represent in your actions and not just by your color. That you demonstrate that you are listening to the people who have been marginalized, the people who feel they've been discriminated against, and you act upon that. So it's about acting upon what you do, because they're not going to thank you. I was asked about the current Home Secretary, whether she was radicalized by racists. Good question from The Guardian, I think. And I said, no, I don't think she needed to be. So I think there's an important point here is that we've got to, if you get into a position of power or responsibility, that you actually use that power and responsibility for good. And ultimately, a society, isn't it, is judged by how you look after its most vulnerable. That's how society is judged. And I don't think we're there. We're nowhere near there. Okay, any other questions?
We've got one here.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm Yasaria Murphin. I'm from Devon and Somerset Fire and Rescue Service. My current role is Partnerships Coordinator, and I also chair our Multicultural Staff Support Network. You mentioned earlier, Nazir, that there are people waiting for you to hear their stories. And I wanted to just ask you really about that. It's a conversation I have had with senior leaders where they've said, we really want to hear more from people of colour. We want to hear about their stories. And the concerns that I have and colleagues have is that actually how do you approach having those conversations in a sensitive manner without potentially re-traumatising those people through retelling those stories? So my question for you really is, what advice do you have in how we can approach this sensitively, and what's the best way to achieve this so that people can feel heard?
Yeah, it's absolutely 100% right. It's not enough. Firstly, it's not enough to listen to those stories. And also, I said the leaders need to be able to listen more, but listening is a skill like any other, so you need training. I don't think we can make assumptions that people will be able to learn how to listen without having been trained to do so. Secondly, in relation to the point you made a moment ago, yes, you will re-traumatize. But then what else do you have? Do you have mental health support? Do you have counseling? Do you have somebody that's able to provide them with guidance and signpost them for help? So that has to be available when you open up this can of worms, which we have to. We have to open up this can. We've got to hear these stories, but we've got to be able to signpost people for help and give them help and not wait for them to tell you that they need help. If you do it as routine, then it doesn't become a big issue. It doesn't. If you have something in place, they come to see you, Alex, and they tell you what's going to happen. After they've told you what's happened, now go and see blah blah blah. Make it available to them. So rather than them asking for it because it becomes a big deal, you make it systemic. As racism is systemic. Let's have the response being systemic too. Okay. There's a question at the back.
Another one from the back.
Good morning. Andy Esson from Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service. Really interesting discussion this morning already. You've mentioned about self-reflection, which every organisation has to definitely subscribe to that. But we're quite fortunate in the industry that we have an external body that also inspects us. And having done a couple of rounds of fire and rescue services nationally, just wondered if you had any thoughts on what could be improved on external inspections and fire and rescue services.
I don't know why you asked me that question. Look, I know people who work for HMIC. I think they're getting better at what they do. Look, I'm in a very privileged position. I'm not employed by anybody, so I can say what I like. All right? Okay. I think that HMIC came late to the party. There's not a party. It's not a party, but they came late to this issue. It was quite. I was absolutely seriously upset that they put their LFB in special measures. I've said that so much. I've said it to them. I said, by doing so, you are deterring other people from self-reflecting. You're deterring other. Why would you, Alex, bring me in to review the culture of hearts? And when I find something, you're now in special measures. Well, it's going to be a slight deterrent, isn't it? So actually, I found that there was an overreaction on HMIC's part, which was because they have not, everything that we found, should have found, shouldn't they? They should have found in all of their reviews. But now they found them. Okay, so yes, let's be optimistic that they're in a better place now, and that they are open to people having more confidence in them. I think that was the issue, actually, that they didn't have confidence in HMIC acting upon the stories that they tell. Hands gone up there. So absolutely, I think they will learn from this experience, but I think they were quite poor until recently. Yeah, there's one more question.
Hello. Thank you, Nazir. I think the first thing I'd like to say is thank you for what you said. I guess I have to say some of it was a bit triggering for me because some of what you were saying is familiar, if not for me, then for people I know. But I really value and welcome the fact that you said what you said. I guess my question is, my name's Liz Fergus, I'm a D&I manager in Herts County Council, and I guess my question is, what do you think we as D&I managers, the leaders in the room as well, and everyone else in the room can do to support people to understand that they can play an active role in addressing some of the issues and challenges that you've spoken about today? Because I think there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of enthusiasm for creating change. I'm personally very invested in creating change because I'm uncomfortable with injustice, and I want to see people kind of considered and respected for who they are, first and foremost, and as human beings, first and foremost. But what do you think we can do to galvanise the effort and the work, because it is work, the work of other people in all of this?
Yeah. I mean, can I say thank you very much for all that you do. Secondly, Alex used the word integrity. There's a bigger word, trust, which I think is under attack. People don't know what they believe anymore. They're being told truth is not truth. When I prosecuted the Rochdale grooming gang, you may not know this, but I was attacked by the far right. They came to my house. They tried to attack my home. I had to have panic alarms placed in my room. I had to have police officers outside my front door, all of which, because they put fake news out there that said to their followers that I didn't prosecute these guys, even though it was the truth. The exact opposite of what they'd been told. So we've got a problem with what people believe and what they don't believe. And so how do you build trust? Simple for me in this respect, that to get confidence, you've got to be competent. Competence feeds confidence. So if the institution organization is publicly, visibly within the organization seen to be doing their job, if you are acting upon, if people have misbehaved, they're out of the organization, following due process, of course. If behaviors are stamped on and misbehaviors are challenged and people can see that will deliver confidence. And that will enable people to be able to trust the institution to deliver on everything else. But as I said, we've been here for 75 years. Windrush, my family were here 62 years. We've been here long enough. You'd think by now we would feel that we're in a good place, and I'm sadly we're not. So I think it's about the strength of this network. It's about ensuring that you hold the feet to the fire. I've said I'm giving evidence against the London Assembly at the end of November because they asked me to come back. Tell us your reflections after a year. And so it shouldn't just be me, though. You should be able to keep an eye on progress, make sure that it's not an agenda, the AOB, that it's a substantive agenda item at every board meeting, that you as an EDI member or the EDI lead is in that board meeting and not simply feeding into a subcommittee or something, that you're not marginalized in any way, shape or form, that you are trusted to be able to do what you do and that they can be trusted to do what they do, and ultimately results will show that. So, this is a long piece of work, no getting away from it, but you should be in the room and not outside the room. Thank you very much indeed.